Ruth Fields stood at the riverbank that misty morning in 1841, her voice rising toward the passing steamboat like it had done 100 times before. The paddle wheels churned through the brown water, the whistle echoed across the plantation fields, and then something impossible happened. When the mist cleared moments later, Ruth was gone, not running, not hiding, simply vanished, as if the river itself had swallowed her whole. But here's what nobody could explain. For 3 days after her disappearance, people swore they heard her singing, that same haunting melody she always sang, floating up from somewhere downstream where no person could possibly survive. The slave catchers searched for weeks. They found her shawl caught on a cypress root 2 miles south. They found footprints that started at the bank and simply stopped mid-stride in the mud. But they never found Ruth. What they did find would make even the most hardened overseer question everything he thought he knew about that stretch of river. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning Ruth disappeared started like any other morning on the Belmont plantation, 5 miles south of New Orleans. The air hung thick and wet, the kind of humidity that made every breath feel like drinking warm soup. And the Mississippi River moved past the property line with its eternal patience, carrying everything from steamboats to secrets in its muddy embrace. Ruth had lived on this land for 23 years, ever since Master Jonathan Belmont purchased her from a trader when she was just 7 years old. A small girl with bright eyes and a voice that could make grown men weep when she sang the old songs her mother taught her before they were separated. The plantation itself sprawled across 300 acres of rich bottomland that flooded regularly when the river rose, leaving behind layers of silt that made the soil perfect for growing sugarcane, but also brought mosquitoes in clouds so thick they seemed like living fog, and snakes that slithered through the fields at night hunting rats, and an atmosphere of decay that permeated everything despite the wealth the land generated for Master Belmont. The main house stood on a slight elevation, a 2-story structure built in the Greek Revival style that was popular among plantation owners who wanted to project an image of classical refinement, with white columns across the front porch and shutters painted green to match the live oak trees that surrounded the property. Behind the main house stretched a complex of outbuildings, including the kitchen house where Ruth spent most of her working hours, the smokehouse where meat was cured, the dairy barn, the carriage house, the overseer's cottage, where Crawford lived alone because no woman would marry him, and farther back still, the quarters where the enslaved people lived in rows of small cabins with dirt floors and walls that let in both cold and heat, depending on the season. Ruth's own history before the Belmont plantation existed only in fragments of memory that had grown hazy with time, and the protective amnesia that sometimes develops when remembering becomes too painful to bear. She could recall her mother's face if she concentrated hard enough, the particular shape of her nose, and the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, which wasn't often in those last months before the sale that separated them. She remembered a place that might have been Virginia or Maryland, somewhere north of Louisiana at least. And she remembered being in a coffle, chained to other enslaved people, including her 2 brothers whose names were James and Robert, walking for what seemed like weeks before being loaded onto a riverboat that brought them south to the New Orleans slave market. The market itself remained vivid in her nightmares even 23 years later. The smell of unwashed bodies packed together in the holding pens, the rough hands of potential buyers examining her teeth and limbs like she was livestock, the terror of the auction block where she stood trembling while white men shouted bids that would determine the entire trajectory of her life. The plantation grew sugarcane primarily, with some cotton in the higher fields where the soil drained better, and Master Belmont owned 42 enslaved people who worked these fields from sunup to sundown under the watchful eye of an overseer named Gideon Crawford, a man with a face like weathered leather and a disposition to match. Ruth worked in the main house most days, cooking and cleaning for the Belmont family, which consisted of Master Jonathan, his wife Constance, and their 3 children, Margaret, William, and little Caroline, who was only 4 and had taken a particular fondness to Ruth, despite the strict rules about such attachments. Master Belmont himself was a man of middle years, who had inherited the plantation from his father and expanded it through what he considered shrewd business practices, which meant working his enslaved people harder than neighboring plantation owners while spending less on their food and shelter. He fancied himself a progressive thinker because he didn't believe in excessive physical punishment, preferring instead what he called psychological management, which meant using fear and the threat of sale to keep people compliant rather than actual whippings. Though Crawford often ignored this preference and wielded his leather strap freely whenever Belmont wasn't watching, Constance Belmont was a pale woman who suffered from various ailments, both real and imagined, spending much of her time in darkened rooms with cool cloths on her forehead, calling for Ruth to bring her tonics and herbal teas that Dinah prepared in the kitchen house using recipes passed down from enslaved healers, whose knowledge of plants and their properties far exceeded anything white doctors understood. The Belmont children existed in that strange space that white children on plantations occupied, simultaneously dependent on enslaved people for their daily care, and being trained to view those same people as property rather than humans worthy of consideration. Margaret was 15 and already being groomed for marriage to the son of another plantation owner, a prospect that made her irritable and prone to taking out her frustrations on the house slaves with petty cruelties and unreasonable demands. William was 12 and showed signs of becoming as brutal as Crawford, delighting in catching younger enslaved children in minor infractions and reporting them for punishment, already practicing the habits of domination that would serve him well if he inherited the plantation as expected. But Caroline was different, still young enough that she hadn't fully internalized the racial hierarchy that structured her world, and she genuinely loved Ruth in the uncomplicated way that small children love the people who care for them, often sneaking into the kitchen house to sit with Ruth while she worked, asking questions about everything and listening to Ruth's stories with wide-eyed fascination. Ruth had developed her habit of singing to the steamboats 3 years earlier, after a particularly brutal week when Crawford had whipped a field hand named Joseph until his back looked like raw meat, all because the man had paused to drink water without permission during the hottest part of the day. Something in Ruth broke a little that week. Watching Joseph's wife Sarah try to tend to wounds that wouldn't heal properly, watching the infection set in despite Sarah's desperate attempts with herbs and poultices, watching Joseph die 6 days later in a shed that smelled like death and despair. Ruth had sung at his burial, a low, mournful song that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her throat, and afterward, she found she couldn't stop singing, especially to the passing boats that represented freedom and movement, and all the things she would never have. Joseph's death had affected everyone in the quarters differently, some people withdrawing into protective silence, while others found religion with renewed intensity. gathering for secret prayer meetings in the woods on Sunday evenings when they were allowed a few hours of rest. Ruth had tried attending these meetings but found the Christian God the preachers spoke about, a God who apparently sanctioned slavery because it was mentioned in the Bible, impossible to reconcile with any notion of justice or mercy she could accept. Instead, she found her own form of spiritual practice in the act of singing to the boats, creating a ritual that had nothing to do with the religion forced upon enslaved people by their masters, and everything to do with asserting her own humanity in whatever small way she could manage. The boats became her congregation, the river her church, and the songs her prayers directed not toward heaven but toward the horizon, where water and sky merged into the promise of elsewhere. The other enslaved people on the plantation came to understand that Ruth's singing served a purpose beyond entertainment or even expression, functioning instead as a kind of survival mechanism that kept her sane in circumstances that drove many people toward either resignation or rebellion. Ada, who was Ruth's age and had been purchased by Belmont around the same time, recognized in Ruth's singing an echo of her own need to maintain some core of self that the masters couldn't reach, some protected interior space where they remained fully human, despite the system's insistence that they were property. The two women had become close friends over the years, sharing confidences in whispered conversations after dark, supporting each other through the various crises that plantation life generated with relentless regularity, from the births of babies who might be sold away at any moment, to the deaths of people they loved, to the constant low-grade terror of knowing that tomorrow could bring separation, punishment, or worse. The other enslaved people on the plantation understood Ruth's need to sing, even if Master Belmont found it peculiar and occasionally irritating. There was old Benjamin, who was nearly 70 and claimed to remember being free in Africa before the slavers came, and young Ada, who was pregnant with her third child and terrified the master would sell this one like he sold the other two, and Marcus, who was the blacksmith and spoke little but whose eyes held a rage that simmered just below the surface of his careful politeness, and Dinah, who cooked alongside Ruth and knew more about poison plants than anyone suspected, and dozens of others whose lives intertwined in the complicated web of survival that defined their existence. Benjamin was particularly important to the community because he served as their living link to a past before slavery, before the Middle Passage, before the transformation of Africans into American property. He told stories on Sunday evenings about his village near the coast where he had been born free, about markets filled with goods from traders who came from across the desert, about ceremonies and dances, and a way of life that bore no resemblance to the brutal exploitation of plantation labor. Some of the younger people doubted Benjamin's stories, figuring that 7 decades was too long for accurate memory, and that perhaps he embellished or invented details to make his past seem better than it was. But Ruth believed him because she recognized in his descriptions the same longing for wholeness that drove her own singing, the need to remember and assert that they had all been something other than slaves before white people decided otherwise. Marcus the blacksmith occupied a unique position on the plantation because his skills made him valuable in ways that field hands were not, which gave him slightly more leverage in his interactions with Crawford and Belmont, though this advantage was marginal at best and could evaporate instantly if he made a wrong move or said something interpreted as insubordinate. Marcus had been born on a different plantation and sold to Belmont 5 years earlier, after his previous owner died, and the estate was liquidated to pay debts. He had left behind a wife and 2 children in that sale, a separation that had hardened something in him that was probably already pretty hard to begin with, and he rarely spoke about them, though everyone knew he carried their memory like a physical weight. His work at the forge was meticulous and intense, every hammer blow against hot iron seeming to contain rage that he couldn't express in words or actions without risking brutal punishment or sale to even worse conditions farther south. Dinah had been cooking for the Belmont family for 15 years, learning her craft from another enslaved woman who had died of pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter when Belmont refused to provide adequate heating or medical care to the quarters. Dinah's knowledge of plants extended far beyond simple culinary applications, encompassing medicinal uses that made her the unofficial doctor for the enslaved community, and certain darker applications that she hinted at but never explicitly discussed. People whispered that Dinah knew which roots and leaves could cause sickness or death if prepared correctly, and that she had on occasion helped enslaved women end unwanted pregnancies resulting from rapes by white men, and that she kept a carefully tended garden behind her cabin where she grew herbs whose purposes she explained to no one. Ruth trusted Dinah completely, and had learned much from her about how to navigate the dangerous terrain of plantation life, when to speak and when to stay silent, how to read the moods of white people and adjust behavior accordingly, how to find small pockets of agency within a system designed to eliminate all autonomy. Ruth herself was what some called handsome rather than pretty, with strong features and skin, the color of polished walnut, and hands that were calloused from work, but still somehow gentle, when she braided little Caroline's hair, or kneaded bread dough, or played the banjo that Marcus had made for Marians, her from scraps of wood and catgut strings. She had never married, though several men on the plantation and neighboring properties had expressed interest over the years, because Ruth carried inside her a grief that made permanent attachments feel impossible. Her mother had been sold when Ruth was 5, and her father, a man she barely remembered, had died in a mill accident before her 3rd birthday, and somewhere in Mississippi, she had 2 brothers she hadn't seen in 18 years and wouldn't recognize if they stood before her. The absence of her family created in Ruth a particular kind of isolation that was common among enslaved people, but which she experienced with unusual intensity. She sometimes lay awake at night in the cabin she shared with Ada and the others, listening to the sounds of breathing and snoring and the occasional cry from someone trapped in a nightmare, and she would try to calculate how old her brothers would be now, whether they were still alive, whether they ever thought about her the way she thought about them. James had been 9 when they were separated, old enough that he might retain some memory of having a sister, but Robert had been only 6, probably too young to remember much of anything about their brief time together as a family. Ruth had created elaborate fantasies over the years about somehow finding her brothers, imagining scenarios where she would recognize them by some distinctive feature, or where they would recognize her voice when she sang. But she understood these were just stories she told herself to cope with the permanence of loss that defined her existence. Her attachment to the riverboats had begun as simple fascination with their size and power and beauty, but over time it had evolved into something more complex and emotionally charged. The boats represented not just physical movement, but the possibility of transformation. The idea that circumstances could change and that the geography that trapped her was not absolute. Ruth had learned the names of many regular boats from other enslaved people who worked closer to the docks or who had conversations with white people who knew about river traffic, and she had assigned personalities to these vessels based on their appearance and the sound of their whistles and the time of day they usually passed. Some boats seemed proud and haughty, their tall smokestacks and elaborate decorations announcing their importance to anyone watching. Others seemed workmanlike and humble, battered by years of service but still faithfully performing their function of moving goods and people up and down the great river. The Morning Star, which would pass on the morning of Ruth's disappearance, held special significance for her because it was the fastest boat on this stretch of river, and because its whistle had a melodic quality that seemed to call specifically to her. The boat's captain, a man named Charles Brennan, who Ruth had never met and never would, had a reputation for running a tight ship where crew members were treated relatively fairly and passengers could expect punctual arrivals at their destinations. Ruth didn't know these details about Brennan or his management style, but she sensed something in the Morning Star's passage that felt different from other boats, some quality of purposefulness or intention that resonated with her own deep need to be moving towards something, rather than remaining static in a situation that violated everything she understood about human dignity and worth. The riverboats fascinated Ruth in a way she couldn't fully explain to anyone, not even to Ada, who was her closest friend despite their age difference. The boats represented motion, possibility, the simple fact that the world extended beyond the boundaries of Belmont land, beyond the fields she could see from the quarters, beyond the narrow strip of existence that defined her days. Some boats were massive sidewheelers that carried hundreds of passengers in grand salons with crystal chandeliers and mahogany paneling, floating palaces where white people in fine clothes danced to orchestra music and drank champagne and played cards for stakes that could buy a human life. Other boats were smaller sternwheelers that hauled freight and passengers of lesser means. Still impressive but more practical, their smokestacks belching black clouds that hung in the humid air long after the boats passed. Ruth had names for the boats she saw regularly, though these weren't their real names, but rather titles she invented based on their appearance or the sound of their whistles. There was the Proud Lady, a massive white sidewheeler with gold trim that passed every Tuesday heading upriver, and the Wandering Ghost, a battered freight hauler that seemed to have no regular schedule but appeared at odd hours trailing smoke like a dark thought. And the Morning Star, the fastest boat on this stretch of river, a sleek stern-wheeler that raced past at dawn twice a week, carrying mail and important passengers who couldn't waste time on slower vessels. On the morning of March 15th, 1841, Ruth woke before sunrise in the cabin she shared with Ada and two other women named Pearl and Constance, who shared a name with the mistress but nothing else, and she dressed quickly in the dim light, pulling on the plain cotton dress that served as her work uniform and wrapping her head in the blue cloth she favored because it had been a gift from Joseph's widow Sarah, before Sarah herself was sold away to a plantation in Alabama. The air outside was unusually thick with mist rolling off the river, the kind of fog that made familiar landmarks disappear and turned the world into something uncertain and dreamlike. Ruth had experienced a strange restlessness the previous night, lying awake long after the others had fallen asleep, feeling an agitation she couldn't name or explain. She had dreamed, during the brief periods when sleep finally came, of standing in water that rose slowly around her body, while her mother's voice called to her from somewhere in the mist, the words indistinct, but the tone urgent and insistent. The dream had woken her multiple times, leaving her heart racing and her nightgown damp with sweat, despite the relative coolness of the March night. When she finally gave up on sleep entirely and rose to begin the day, she felt both exhausted and strangely energized, as if something significant was about to happen, though she had no rational basis for this premonition. Ada had stirred when Ruth rose, opening one eye to look at her friend in the dimness and asking if everything was all right. Ruth had nodded and whispered that she was fine, just restless. And Ada had accepted this explanation and rolled over to steal a few more minutes of sleep before the bell rang to summon everyone to their day's labor. Ruth stood for a moment looking at Ada's sleeping form, feeling a surge of affection for this woman who had been such a steady presence in her life. And she almost reached out to touch Ada's shoulder, to wake her and tell her about the strange feelings coursing through her. But she stopped herself, because what was there to say that wouldn't sound like foolishness or superstition? What words could capture the sense that the world had become thin somehow, that the barrier between what was and what might be had grown permeable in ways she lacked vocabulary to describe? Ruth walked toward the main house to begin breakfast preparations, but something pulled her toward the river instead, some instinct or premonition she couldn't name. Her feet carried her down the worn path through the pecan trees, past the smokehouse and the tool shed, past the edge of the cane fields, where the stalks rustled in the pre-dawn breeze, and finally to the muddy bank, where she had stood so many times before to watch the boats and sing her songs. The mist was so heavy she could barely see 10 feet in front of her, and the river moved invisibly beyond the curtain of white. A presence felt more than seen, the subtle slap of water against the bank and the whisper of current, the only evidence of its existence. The walk to the river took perhaps 10 minutes, during which Ruth's mind wandered through memories and half-formed thoughts that seemed to come from outside her conscious control. She found herself thinking about her mother, not the traumatic memory of their separation, but earlier moments when they had been together and relatively safe, before the sail that split their family into pieces. She remembered her mother singing while doing laundry, remembered the way her voice would rise and fall in patterns that seemed to follow the rhythm of scrubbing clothes against the washboard, remembered feeling protected and loved in those moments despite the larger context of enslavement that defined their existence. She wondered if her mother was still alive, whether she was still enslaved or had somehow found freedom, whether she ever thought about the daughter she had been forced to leave behind. And these thoughts felt especially sharp and painful on this misty morning, when the world seemed to exist in a space between waking and dreaming. Ruth also found herself thinking about little Caroline and feeling guilty about the affection she had developed for the white child despite knowing better, despite understanding that such attachments across the color line were dangerous and ultimately doomed, because Caroline would grow up to be a slave owner who would view Ruth and people like her as property rather than persons deserving of basic human consideration. But Caroline was only 4 and still innocent in the way that very young children are innocent, and Ruth couldn't help responding to the child's genuine warmth and curiosity, couldn't help feeling something protective toward a little girl who had no choice about the circumstances of her birth any more than Ruth had chosen hers. The whole situation was tragic in ways that Ruth understood better than Caroline ever would, at least until life taught her harder lessons about the cost of the system that enriched her family. Ruth stood there for several minutes, breathing the wet air and listening to the silence that wasn't quite silence but rather a collection of small sounds that merged into something peaceful. Then, from somewhere upstream, she heard it, the distinctive whistle of the morning star, that clear 3-note call that the captain used to announce his approach, and Ruth began to sing without really deciding to. the melody rising from her throat like something with its own will. The song had no words exactly, just syllables that flowed together in patterns her mother had taught her, sounds that predated English and slavery, and everything that defined her current existence, an old song that might have been African or might have been something else entirely. A universal human expression of longing that needed no specific language. As Ruth sang, she felt something shifting in the atmosphere around her, a change in air pressure or temperature, or perhaps in some quality that had no name in conventional physics. The mist seemed to grow thicker and simultaneously more luminous, as if light was being generated from within the water vapor itself, rather than filtering through it from the rising sun. Ruth's voice grew stronger without her consciously increasing volume, the melody expanding and taking on harmonic layers that shouldn't have been possible from a single human throat, as if the air itself was singing along with her or amplifying her sound in ways that defied normal acoustics. She felt simultaneously grounded in her body, aware of her feet planted in the mud, and her lungs expanding and contracting with breath, and somehow outside her body, observing herself from a perspective that floated above and beside and within her all at once. The sensation was not frightening exactly, though it contained elements that might have produced fear in different circumstances. Instead, Ruth felt a kind of recognition, as if she had been waiting her entire life for this moment without knowing it, as if everything that had happened before, all the suffering and loss and grinding daily humiliation of enslaved existence, had been preparation for this single instant when the boundary between what was possible and what was impossible would dissolve like sugar in water. She thought about her mother and her brothers and everyone she had loved and lost, and she thought about Ada and Marcus and Dinah and Benjamin, and all the people still trapped in the system that claimed ownership of their bodies and labor. And she thought about Caroline, and felt a pang of regret that the child would grow up without understanding what she had lost when Ruth disappeared. And all these thoughts occurred simultaneously and instantaneously, not in linear sequence but as a single complex emotion that contained multitudes. The whistle came again, closer now, and Ruth could hear the churn of paddle wheels cutting through water, the hiss of steam, the deep rumble of engines working hard against the current. She sang louder, projecting her voice toward where she imagined the boat must be, though the mist was still too thick to see anything clearly. There was something different about this morning, some quality to the air, or the light, or perhaps to her own state of mind that made everything feel heightened and strange, as if the boundary between the possible and impossible had grown thin enough to step through if you knew exactly where to place your feet. The morning star's whistle sounded a third time, so close now that Ruth felt the vibration in her chest, and for just a moment the mist parted enough for her to glimpse the boat itself, a dark shape with lights glowing in its windows. And then something extraordinary happened. The boat's whistle held a note longer than usual, sustained until it seemed to harmonize with Ruth's song, two sounds merging into one. And in that moment Ruth felt a pulling sensation, as if invisible hands had grabbed her from behind, and the world tilted sideways in a way that had nothing to do with balance or vertigo, and everything to do with reality itself shifting on some fundamental axis. Ruth tried to scream, but no sound came out. Or perhaps the sound was there, but traveling in a direction she couldn't follow, and she felt herself moving, though her feet remained planted in the mud, moving toward or through or with the river in a way that made no physical sense. The last thing she registered clearly was the feel of her shawl slipping from her shoulders and the sound of her own song still echoing across the water. And then there was a sensation like falling upward in darkness that somehow contained light. And then nothing, or everything, or something in between. When the mist began to clear 20 minutes later, as the sun finally muscled its way above the eastern horizon and began burning off the moisture, Ada came looking for Ruth because breakfast needed starting and Master Belmont would be furious if his eggs weren't ready by 7 o'clock. Ada walked the same path Ruth had taken, calling her friend's name softly at first, and then more urgently, and when she reached the riverbank, she found it empty, except for Ruth's blue shawl, lying in the mud at the water's edge. Ada picked up the shawl with trembling hands and looked out at the river, which was now clearly visible in the growing light, its surface empty of everything except a few logs and some debris floating downstream. The morning star was long gone, miles upriver by now, carrying passengers who had no idea that something impossible had just occurred on a plantation bank somewhere behind them. Ada stood holding the shawl for several long minutes, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, or rather what she wasn't seeing, because the absence of Ruth from a location where her shawl remained suggested scenarios that Ada's mind resisted accepting. She examined the muddy bank carefully, looking for footprints that might indicate Ruth had walked into the water. But the tracks were confused and unclear, multiple impressions, overlapping in ways that told no coherent story. There were marks that could have been made by Ruth's feet pointing toward the water, but they seemed to stop abruptly, about 3 feet from the actual river's edge, as if Ruth had simply ceased to exist mid-stride. And there were no corresponding marks showing a return path or any indication of where she might have gone. Ada called Ruth's name several more times, her voice growing increasingly desperate despite her attempts to maintain composure, because drawing too much attention could bring Crawford down on everyone, and the overseer had little patience for what he would view as enslaved people shirking their duties. But Ruth didn't answer, and didn't appear, and the riverbank remained stubbornly empty, except for the shawl which Ada clutched against her chest like a talisman, or a piece of evidence whose meaning she couldn't yet decipher. Finally, knowing she had no choice, Ada walked back toward the quarters to report Ruth's absence, her mind already racing through possible explanations and their likely consequences, none of them good. Ada reported Ruth's absence to Dinah, who told Marcus, who reluctantly informed Crawford the overseer, who flew into a rage at the idea that one of the house slaves had apparently run off, and by noon the whole plantation was in an uproar with search parties forming and slave catchers being summoned from New Orleans and Master Belmont, personally interrogating every enslaved person on the property about what they knew of Ruth's plans. But nobody knew anything because there were no plans, no whispered conversations about escape routes or safe houses, no hidden supplies or suspicious behavior in the days before her disappearance. Ruth had simply vanished, like smoke dispersing in wind. Crawford's rage manifested in predictable ways, including the immediate whipping of 2 field hands he suspected of lying about their knowledge of Ruth's whereabouts, though in truth, neither man knew anything, and their punishment served only to satisfy Crawford's need to feel in control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his authority. He organized the first search party within an hour of being informed about Ruth's disappearance, riding out with 3 other white men from neighboring plantations who sometimes assisted with slave catching in exchange for reciprocal help when they needed it. The men brought dogs that were trained to follow human scent, though as events would prove these animals were about to encounter something that defied their training and instincts in ways their handlers couldn't begin to understand. Master Belmont's interrogations of the enslaved people revealed nothing useful, but did create an atmosphere of heightened tension and fear throughout the quarters. As people understood that Ruth's absence had put everyone under increased scrutiny and suspicion, Belmont questioned Ada extensively, demanding to know every detail of their friendship and any conversations that might have hinted at escape plans. And Ada answered truthfully that Ruth had never spoken of running away and had seemed no different in the days before her disappearance than she had been for years. Belmont studied Ada's face carefully, looking for signs of deception, but Ada had learned long ago how to school her features into expressions that revealed nothing, a skill that all enslaved people had to develop for survival. The search expanded throughout the day to include not just the immediate plantation grounds but the surrounding area within a 5-mile radius, checking every possible hiding place from barns to cane fields to the homes of free black people who might have offered assistance to a runaway. Crawford personally visited these free black households, threatening them with dire consequences if they were found to be harboring Ruth, and the free people opened their doors and submitted to searches while maintaining careful dignity in the face of Crawford's aggressive posturing. None of them had seen Ruth or had any information about her whereabouts, and Crawford left each location more frustrated than before, unable to accept that a slave could simply vanish without trace or accomplice. The first search party consisted of Crawford and 3 other white men who rode up and down the river road for miles in both directions, asking at neighboring plantations if anyone had seen a woman matching Ruth's description, checking the docks in New Orleans where runaways sometimes tried to board boats as stowaways, questioning the free black community in the city about whether any strangers had appeared seeking help. They found nothing. No trace, no witness, no hint of where Ruth might have gone or how she had traveled there. One of the slave catchers, a man named Albert Dunn who made his living tracking runaways with dogs, brought his best bloodhounds to the riverbank where Ruth's shawl was found, and the dogs picked up her scent easily enough and followed it 20 feet from the bank toward the water. And then the dogs stopped and whined and refused to go further, which Dunn said he'd never seen before, as if the scent simply ended mid-air like Ruth had sprouted wings and flown away. The second day after Ruth's disappearance brought the first strange report from a fisherman named Horace Webb, who lived in a shack 3 miles downstream from the Belmont plantation. Webb came to Crawford and said he'd heard singing that morning, a woman's voice floating up from the river around dawn, the same melody he'd heard many times before when he passed the Belmont property because Ruth's voice carried far across water. Crawford asked if Webb had seen the woman, and Webb shook his head and said the mist was too heavy, but he was sure it was the same voice, that distinctive quality that made the song sound both sorrowful and hopeful at the same time. Crawford dismissed Webb as a drunk fool who had imagined the whole thing, but the next morning brought a similar report from a boat hand on a freight hauler who swore he heard a woman singing from somewhere near the bank around dawn, though when they looked there was nobody visible and the captain wouldn't let them stop to investigate. Webb's report had actually been more detailed than Crawford let on to others, because the fisherman had described not just hearing Ruth's voice, but experiencing a strange sensation while listening to it, a feeling that the boundaries between water and air and earth had become unclear, that the world had briefly become liquid and permeable in ways that normal reality didn't allow. Webb said he had been checking his nets when he heard the singing, and for a moment He couldn't determine whether the sound was coming from upstream or downstream, from the water or the air, from outside him or inside his own head. He said it had frightened him badly enough that he abandoned his nets and returned to his shack, where he spent the rest of the day drinking whiskey to calm his nerves, and he only came forward with the information because his wife had convinced him that Crawford needed to know, though now he regretted saying anything because Crawford's dismissive response made him feel foolish for having shared what was clearly a significant experience. The boat hand who made the second report worked on a vessel called the Delta Rose that ran cargo between New Orleans and various plantations along the river, and he told a similar story about hearing a woman's voice singing in the mist and feeling disoriented by the sound in ways that went beyond normal acoustic phenomena. The man, whose name was Jackson Porter, said that other crew members had heard it too, and that one of the passengers, a merchant from New Orleans, had come out on deck to ask what the sound was and where it was coming from. Porter said they had all looked toward the bank where the singing seemed to originate, but the fog was too thick to see anything clearly, and by the time they passed the area and the mist began to thin, the singing had stopped and there was nothing to indicate its source or even that it had been real, rather than some collective auditory hallucination. By the third day, the story had spread through the enslaved community along that stretch of river like fire through dry grass, growing and changing with each retelling. Some said Ruth had been taken by the river spirits that old Benjamin sometimes spoke about, ancient powers from Africa that protected their people in mysterious ways. Others insisted she had learned to walk on water like Jesus and had simply crossed to the other side where freedom waited. A few claimed she had been hiding in the cane fields all along and was singing to throw the search parties off her trail. But the most persistent rumor, the one that Ada started though she never admitted it, was that Ruth had somehow merged with the river itself, that her song had become so intertwined with the sound of water and boats and morning mist that she existed now in some in-between state, not quite human and not quite spirit, but something new that the world had no proper name for. Master Belmont offered a reward of $200 for information leading to Ruth's return, a substantial sum that would have tempted many people to come forward if they had any genuine knowledge to share, but the reward went unclaimed because there was no information to be had. The slave catchers eventually gave up and returned to New Orleans, and Crawford stopped organizing search parties after 2 weeks, and life on the Belmont plantation returned to its normal brutal routine, except now there was an absence at its center, a Ruth-shaped hole in the daily patterns that nobody seemed able to fill adequately. Little Caroline Belmont cried for 3 days straight when she understood that Ruth wasn't coming back, and no amount of consolation from her mother could calm her down. The child kept asking where Ruth had gone, and when she would return, and finally, Constance Belmont told her daughter that Ruth had gone to heaven, which was a lie, but the kind of lie adults tell children to protect them from harsh truths. Caroline seemed to accept this explanation, though for weeks afterward she would sometimes stand at her bedroom window, staring toward the river and humming the melodies Ruth used to sing when she braided Caroline's hair before bedtime. Ada found herself unable to sleep in the cabin she had shared with Ruth, so she asked permission to move to different quarters, and Marcus grew even more silent and angry than before. His hammer strikes at the forge, taking on a quality of barely controlled violence that made the other men give him wide berth. Dinah started burning a candle every night in the spot where Ruth used to sleep, a small act of remembrance that the overseer never discovered because it happened after dark, when white people rarely ventured into the quarters. Old Benjamin began telling stories about Ruth as if she had already passed into legend, speaking of her as the woman who sang herself free, and the voice that became water. And the younger enslaved children would gather around him in the evenings to hear these tales, their eyes wide with wonder and hope at the idea that escape was possible even in forms they couldn't yet imagine. 3 months after Ruth's disappearance, a steamboat captain named Josiah Winters came to the Belmont plantation with a strange tale to share. Captain Winters ran a passenger boat that made regular trips between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, and he claimed that on foggy mornings when passing the Belmont property, his passengers sometimes reported hearing a woman singing from somewhere near the bank, though visual confirmation was impossible due to the mist. More peculiar still, Captain Winters said that on 2 separate occasions, his boat's whistle had seemingly responded on its own to this singing, sustaining notes longer than he had pulled the cord, as if the machinery itself was trying to harmonize with the mysterious voice. Master Belmont listened to this story with a skeptical expression and asked Captain Winters what he expected to gain by spreading such nonsense. Winters shrugged and said he expected nothing but thought Belmont should know that his escaped slave had apparently become a ghost story that other boat captains were beginning to discuss in the taverns along the waterfront. Belmont dismissed Winters with barely concealed contempt, but privately the story unsettled him because it suggested Ruth's disappearance was becoming something larger than a simple case of a runaway slave, transforming instead into a tale that challenged the natural order of things in ways that made wealthy plantation owners nervous. The summer of 1841 brought intense heat and humidity, even by Louisiana standards, and the enslaved people worked the cane fields under a sun that seemed determined to bake them into the very soil they tended. Ada gave birth to her baby in July, a girl she named Ruth, despite the risk of attracting Crawford's ire for honoring someone who had presumably run away, and the child proved healthy and strong, despite the conditions of her birth in a cabin with only Dinah and 2 other women to serve as midwives. Ada would sometimes take baby Ruth down to the riverbank in the early morning hours before work began, and she would stand where her friend had last stood and sing softly to the water, teaching the baby the melodies her namesake had once performed for passing boats. Marcus finally spoke about Ruth's disappearance in late August, breaking his months-long silence on the subject during a conversation with Benjamin and 2 other men in the forge, where they had gathered after dark to sharpen tools for the next day's work. Marcus said he believed Ruth had found a way out that none of them had considered, that maybe running wasn't always about using your legs to carry you north, but sometimes about using your voice or your spirit or some part of yourself that the masters couldn't chain no matter how hard they tried. Benjamin nodded and said this matched certain stories from his childhood in Africa, tales of people who could transform themselves into animals or merge with elements like water and fire. And though such magic had grown weak in this new land where the spirits were different, perhaps it wasn't completely gone. Perhaps it waited for moments of great need to resurface in unexpected ways. The other men listened to this discussion with varying degrees of belief and skepticism, but all of them wanted it to be true because the alternative was accepting that Ruth had drowned or been caught and sold to some even worse situation farther south, and hope required them to embrace the impossible rather than surrender to the probable. This pattern repeated itself throughout the enslaved community that summer, with people choosing to believe in mystery and magic rather than tragedy and loss, with Ruth's absence transforming from a source of grief into a source of inspiration, proof that the system that bound them was not as absolute as it appeared, that gaps and loopholes existed for those desperate or brave or lucky enough to find them. Constance Belmont hired a new house slave named Judith to take over Ruth's cooking and cleaning duties, and Judith was competent enough, but lacked Ruth's intuitive understanding of what was needed before being asked, and little Caroline refused to let Judith touch her hair no matter how much her mother insisted. The Belmont household adjusted to the change because white people were good at adjusting when it came to the labor of enslaved people, viewing them as essentially interchangeable despite their individual quirks and qualities. But something had shifted in the atmosphere of the big house, some subtle loss of comfort or order that none of the family could quite articulate, but all of them somehow felt. In September, a freed black woman named Celeste Broussard, who lived in New Orleans and made her living as a laundress, came to the plantation asking to speak with the enslaved people about Ruth. Crawford initially refused her request, but Celeste explained that Ruth's mother, who Celeste had known years ago, had recently died in Mississippi and had sent a message through the network of free and enslaved black people asking if anyone knew what had become of her daughter. Crawford grudgingly allowed Celeste to spend an hour in the quarters under his supervision, and Ada told her everything she knew about Ruth's disappearance, including the strange reports of singing heard downstream and the theories about river spirits and transformation. Celeste was a woman of perhaps 50 years, with gray threading through her dark hair and eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of someone who had survived the impossible multiple times over. She had been born enslaved in Haiti during the Revolution and had somehow made her way to Louisiana as a child, though the details of that journey were mysterious and she never spoke of them directly. She had purchased her own freedom in her 20s through a combination of hard work, careful saving, and what some people whispered was involvement in the underground networks that helped enslaved people escape to the north or to free territories. Celeste's reputation in the free black community of New Orleans was formidable, as she was known to be someone who could be trusted with secrets and who had connections to various forms of knowledge that extended beyond conventional Christianity into older African spiritual practices that most enslaved people had been forced to abandon or hide. When Ada finished describing Ruth's disappearance, Celeste sat quietly for several long minutes, her eyes closed and her hands folded in her lap, appearing to be thinking or praying or perhaps communing with spirits that nobody else could perceive. Crawford shifted impatiently and opened his mouth to hurry her along, but something in Celeste's bearing made him hesitate, some quality of presence that commanded respect despite her lack of any official authority. Finally, Celeste opened her eyes and looked directly at Ada with an intensity that made the younger woman catch her breath. Celeste listened carefully to all of this, and then said something that would echo through the community for years afterward. She said that in certain African traditions, water was understood as a doorway between worlds, that rivers especially were seen as roads that ran in multiple directions simultaneously, not just upstream and downstream, but also sideways, into realms that existed parallel to the everyday world. She said that if Ruth had been singing at the exact moment when the river's power was strongest, which was dawn when darkness and light balanced on the edge of transformation, and if her intention was pure and her need was great, then perhaps the river had heard her request and answered in its own way, taking her somewhere beyond the reach of masters and overseers and slave catchers. Though whether that somewhere was geographical or spiritual or something else entirely, no mortal could say for certain. Celeste elaborated further, explaining that the old spiritual systems from Africa recognized that reality was more complex and layered than what white people's Christianity acknowledged, that there were spaces between this world and other worlds where transformation became possible, where the rules that governed ordinary existence could be suspended or rearranged. She said that certain people, usually those who had suffered greatly or who possessed particular spiritual sensitivity, could sometimes access these in-between spaces, either intentionally through ritual and prayer, or accidentally through a combination of circumstance and desperation. She suggested that Ruth might have been such a person, someone whose pain and longing had opened a door that remained closed to most people, and that her singing had been the key that unlocked that door at the precise moment when the morning star's passage created a confluence of energies that made transformation possible. Crawford interrupted at this point and ordered Celeste to stop filling the slaves' heads with dangerous nonsense. But the damage, if it could be called that, was already done. Celeste's words gave shape and structure to the inchoate feelings that had been building in the community for months, transforming Ruth's disappearance from a confusing mystery into something that almost made sense within a worldview that most white people refused to acknowledge or understand. After Celeste left, heading back to New Orleans with the knowledge that she would report Ruth's probable fate to those who had loved her mother, the enslaved people on the Belmont plantation began approaching the river with a new kind of respect and attention, watching the water with eyes that searched for signs of the impossible, listening to the boat whistles with ears that waited for harmony. October brought cooler weather and the beginning of harvest season, when the cane had to be cut and processed quickly before the first frost damaged the crop, and everyone worked brutal hours that left them too exhausted for much conversation or reflection. But even in their exhaustion, people would sometimes pause at the end of a row and gaze toward the river in the distance, wondering if Ruth was out there somewhere, watching them, if she could see their struggles from whatever place she had gone, if she ever regretted leaving, or if freedom, however it was achieved, was worth any price, including the loss of everyone and everything familiar. Young Ada's baby, little Ruth, began to show signs of unusual perceptiveness despite her tender age, often turning her head toward the river as if listening to something beyond normal hearing, and Ada chose to interpret this as evidence that her friend was still present somehow, still watching over them through the infant who carried her name. This belief brought Ada comfort during the long, difficult months of new motherhood under slavery, when the constant fear of losing this child like she had lost the others threatened to overwhelm her capacity for joy in her daughter's existence. The first anniversary of Ruth's disappearance came and went without any official acknowledgement from the Belmont family, but the enslaved community marked the date by gathering at the riverbank just before dawn, more than 30 people standing in the cold morning air waiting for the morning star's whistle. When it came, that distinctive three-note call echoing across the water, everyone began to sing, a low, harmonious sound that combined dozens of individual voices into something larger and more powerful than any single person could produce. They sang Ruth's melody, the wordless song she had performed so many times for passing boats, and for just a moment, as the morning star appeared around the river bend, its paddle wheels churning and its smokestacks trailing dark clouds against the lightening sky, something strange happened with the boat's whistle, which sustained a note far longer than seemed mechanically possible, holding the sound until it merged with the singing and became indistinguishable from it. The gathering at the riverbank had been organized quietly in the days leading up to the anniversary, with word passing through the quarters in whispered conversations and subtle gestures that white people wouldn't notice or understand. Ada had initiated the planning, feeling a deep need to honor her friend's memory in some meaningful way. And others had readily agreed, because Ruth's disappearance had taken on symbolic significance that extended beyond their personal feelings about her as an individual. She had become, in the years since her vanishing, a representation of hope and possibility, evidence that the system that bound them was not impermeable, that escape existed even if its form remained mysterious and its mechanics unclear. The moment when the morning star's whistle harmonized with their collective singing created a palpable shock that ran through the group, people gasping and grabbing each other's hands as the sound washed over them with almost physical force. Some people cried, tears streaming down their faces as they continued singing through their emotion. Others stood transfixed, their mouths open but no sound emerging as they experienced something that transcended normal sensory experience. Benjamin, who was by then very frail and would die within the year, smiled with an expression of profound satisfaction, as if something he had long suspected was being confirmed before his failing eyes. The boat's captain, Charles Brennan, later reported the whistle malfunction to the boat's chief engineer, demanding an explanation for why the mechanism had stuck in the open position for what he estimated was 30 to 45 seconds, far longer than should have been mechanically possible given the steam pressure and valve design. The engineer examined the whistle apparatus thoroughly and found nothing wrong with it. No stuck valves or pressure anomalies, or any physical explanation for the reported behavior. Brennan found this unsatisfying but ultimately shrugged and moved on, filing it mentally under the category of river mysteries that accumulated over years of navigating the Mississippi, inexplicable events that occasionally occurred and which practical men learned not to dwell upon too extensively. Master Belmont died unexpectedly in February of 1842, suffering what the doctor called an apoplectic fit while reviewing the plantation's financial records in his study. His death threw the property into temporary chaos as his will was read and various debts came to light that nobody had suspected existed. Constance Belmont inherited the plantation but lacked her husband's business acumen, and within 6 months had fallen behind on payments to creditors who began making noise about foreclosure. The enslaved people watched these developments with interest and a certain grim satisfaction, understanding that white people's financial troubles often created opportunities for black people to slip through cracks in the system, though such opportunities usually came at the cost of families being separated through sales to different buyers. In September of 1842, Constance Belmont made the decision to sell the plantation and move back to her family's property in South Carolina. The sale happened quickly, and the new owner was a man named Vincent Marchant, who had made his fortune in shipping and wanted a country estate where he could pretend to be landed gentry. Marchant took possession in October and immediately began making changes, including the dismissal of Crawford as overseer and the hiring of a younger man named Dale Preston, who had different ideas about plantation management, believing that slightly better treatment of enslaved workers led to increased productivity and therefore higher profits. Under Preston's supervision, the atmosphere on what was now the Marchant plantation became marginally less oppressive, though slavery remained slavery regardless of how enlightened a particular overseer considered himself. Preston allowed the enslaved people more freedom of movement on Sundays and didn't punish minor infractions with automatic whippings, and he turned a blind eye to the gatherings that happened at the riverbank on certain mornings when people went there to sing. Preston himself had heard the stories about Ruth and the mysterious voice that supposedly still echoed across the water on foggy dawns. And while he didn't believe in ghosts or spirits or any such foolishness, he figured there was no harm in letting the slaves have their rituals if it kept them docile and productive. Ada's daughter Ruth grew into a toddler who loved the river with a passion that worried her mother, the child constantly pulling toward the water whenever they walked near the bank, babbling excitedly at passing boats and laughing at the sound of steamboat whistles in a way that seemed to suggest some understanding beyond her years. By her second birthday, little Ruth could hum the melody her namesake had sung, though Ada swore she had never explicitly taught it to her daughter, the child seeming to absorb it from the air itself, or perhaps from some deeper source that connected her to the woman whose name she carried. Benjamin died in his sleep in March of 1843, peacefully for once, his body simply giving out after 7 decades of hardship and struggle. The community buried him in the small cemetery plot beyond the quarters, and at his funeral Ada sang Ruth's melody while holding her daughter, and baby Ruth joined in with her small voice, and the combination of their singing made several people cry because it felt like a connection spanning generations, linking the old man who remembered Africa to the woman who had disappeared into mystery to the child who represented some unknown future. After Benjamin's death, Marcus became the informal keeper of stories and histories, though he lacked Benjamin's gift for narrative and told the old tales in a more terse and factual way that nevertheless preserved their essential truths. The years passed with the relentless quality of river current, carrying everything forward, whether ready or not, and life on the Marchant plantation settled into new rhythms. Under Preston's supervision, Ruth's disappearance receded from immediate concern into the realm of legend, a story told to new arrivals and children, evolving with each retelling into something both more and less than the truth. Some versions had Ruth walking on water all the way to Ohio. Others had her transforming into a bird or a fish, or pure sound. Others still insisted she had simply drowned, and the ghostly singing was just wind through the cypress trees, playing tricks on people's desperate ears. But the singing continued to be reported, not every morning but often enough that it became an accepted part of the river's reality along that stretch of bank. Boat captains included it in their mental maps of the waterway, a peculiar local phenomenon that existed somewhere between fact and folklore. Some captains made a point of whistling when passing the old Belmont property at dawn, waiting to hear if the mysterious voice would respond, and they reported various results, sometimes hearing nothing, sometimes hearing what might have been singing or might have been imagination, occasionally experiencing that strange mechanical hiccup where their whistles sustained notes longer than physics should allow. In 1845, a journalist from New Orleans named Frederick Lawson became interested in the story of Ruth's disappearance after hearing multiple boat captains discuss it in a waterfront tavern. Lawson made the trip to the Marchant plantation and interviewed Preston, who told him the basic facts as he understood them, and then Lawson spoke with several of the enslaved people, including Ada and Marcus, who shared their perspectives on what had happened and what they believed it meant. Lawson published an article in the New Orleans Daily Picayune titled "The Singing Ghost of the Mississippi," which treated the story with a mixture of journalistic skepticism and romantic embellishment, never quite committing to whether he believed in supernatural explanations but clearly finding the mystery compelling enough to share with readers. The article brought some unwanted attention to the plantation, with curiosity seekers occasionally making the trip from New Orleans to stand on the riverbank at dawn, hoping to hear the mysterious singing. Preston quickly put a stop to these visits, by posting guards and threatening trespassers with prosecution. But the publicity had already achieved what Lawson probably intended, transforming Ruth from a specific person with a specific history into a symbol that meant different things to different audiences. For white readers, she was a spooky tale, entertainment over morning coffee, a brief diversion from their ordinary concerns. For black readers, especially those who were enslaved or who had family members still in bondage, she was hope made audible, evidence that escape was possible even when it seemed impossible, proof that the masters did not control everything despite their pretensions. Ada continued to bring her daughter to the riverbank regularly, and by the time little Ruth was 5 years old, the child could sing the melody perfectly, her young voice carrying across the water with surprising power. Ada taught her daughter everything she remembered about the original Ruth, creating a verbal portrait of a woman who was brave and sad and complicated and ultimately mysterious. Someone who had chosen, through action or circumstance, or some combination of both, to step outside the boundaries of normal existence rather than continue living within constraints that violated her spirit. In 1848, Vincent Marchant made the surprising decision to free 5 of his enslaved workers, including Ada and her daughter, granting them manumission papers that allowed them to leave the plantation as freed people. Marchant's reasons for this act were complex and probably had more to do with northern business partners who were pressuring him to demonstrate some commitment to gradual emancipation than with any genuine moral awakening. But the result was the same, regardless of motivation. Ada and young Ruth were free, along with 3 others, and they made their way to New Orleans, where they joined the city's free black community and began building new lives that were still limited and dangerous, but at least not defined by someone else's ownership of their bodies. Ada found work as a seamstress, and young Ruth attended a small school run by free black educators who taught reading and writing and arithmetic to children whose parents could afford the modest fees. The girl proved to be a bright student with a particular aptitude for music and mathematics, and as she grew into adolescence, she developed other talents, including a gift for drawing and an ability to tell stories that held people's attention. She was a strange child in some ways, often seeming distant or distracted, as if listening to voices beyond normal perception, and she maintained her fascination with rivers and boats, spending her free time at the docks, watching steamboats arrive and depart, studying their designs and operations with an intensity that puzzled her mother. When Ruth turned 16 in 1859, she told Ada she wanted to work on the river, to get a job on one of the steamboats as a chambermaid or kitchen helper, anything that would allow her to spend time on the water. Ada was horrified by this idea, pointing out the dangers that young black women faced in such environments. The constant threat of assault from white men who believed themselves entitled to any black woman's body regardless of her free status. The possibility of being kidnapped and sold back into slavery, which happened more often than anyone wanted to admit. But Ruth was insistent with the particular stubbornness of teenagers who believe they understand the world better than their parents. And eventually Ada relented, helping her daughter obtain a position on a small freight boat called the Delta Queen that ran regular routes between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. Ruth worked on the Delta Queen for 2 years, earning wages that helped support her mother and gradually learning the rhythms and realities of river life. She heard countless stories from other boat workers and passengers, tales of the river's moods and dangers, accounts of people who had drowned or been rescued, legends about ghosts and strange phenomena that supposedly haunted various stretches of water. She paid particular attention to stories about the singing ghost near the old Belmont property, which by 1860 was called the Marchant Plantation universally, and which had acquired new layers of myth in the nearly 2 decades since the original Ruth's disappearance. Working on the Delta Queen exposed young Ruth to a world far more complex and diverse than anything she had experienced in New Orleans, even in the relatively cosmopolitan environment of the free black community where she had been raised. The boat carried all manner of passengers, from wealthy plantation owners traveling between their properties, to merchants conducting business along the river, to poor white settlers heading west in search of better opportunities to free black people, trying to navigate the dangerous spaces between enslavement and genuine liberty. Ruth's position as a chambermaid and kitchen helper made her largely invisible to most white passengers, who barely registered her presence as she cleaned their cabins or served their meals. But this invisibility allowed her to observe and overhear conversations that revealed the full spectrum of human nature, in all its cruelty and occasional kindness. She learned quickly that being free didn't mean being safe, that her papers declaring her manumission could be challenged or ignored or simply destroyed by white people who decided they wanted to claim her as property, and she developed a cautious watchfulness that never completely relaxed, even when circumstances seemed benign. She witnessed free black people being kidnapped off the docks in broad daylight, their protests ignored by authorities who either didn't care or actively participated in the theft of human beings for profit. She saw enslaved people being transported south to be sold, chained together in groups that shuffled onto boats with expressions of such profound despair that Ruth had to look away or risk being overwhelmed by the injustice of it all. She also saw small moments of resistance and humanity, enslaved people helping each other in subtle ways that white overseers didn't notice, free black people creating networks of support and information that operated beneath the radar of official society. The captain of the Delta Queen, a man named Robert Harrison, ran his vessel with relative fairness compared to many other boat captains, paying his workers reasonably and not tolerating excessive abuse from passengers toward crew members, regardless of their race. This didn't mean Harrison was particularly enlightened about racial matters, as he still maintained the fundamental assumption that white people deserved better treatment and more consideration than black people. But within the constraints of his era and environment, he was less terrible than he might have been. He had noticed young Ruth's intelligence and her particular interest in the boat's operations, and he occasionally explained mechanical or navigational details to her during quiet moments, not out of any philosophical commitment to education across racial lines, but simply because he appreciated having someone to talk to who asked good questions and listened carefully to the answers. Through these conversations, young Ruth learned about how steamboats worked, the engineering challenges of moving heavy vessels against strong currents, the constant need for fuel wood, which was loaded at numerous stops along the river, the dangers of snags and sandbars and fog that could ground or sink even experienced captains' vessels, and the economic calculations that determined routes and schedules and cargo priorities. She learned that the Mississippi River was essentially a highway of commerce that connected diverse regions and populations, that the boats were more than just transportation, but were actually moving communities unto themselves, where people from vastly different backgrounds temporarily coexisted in close proximity, and that the river itself was a living entity whose moods and behaviors required constant respect and attention from anyone who made their living upon its waters. One morning in April of 1861, with the nation tearing itself apart over slavery and states' rights and all the contradictions that had been building since the country's founding, young Ruth convinced the captain of the Delta Queen to let her stand on deck as they passed the Marchant plantation. The morning was misty, the kind of heavy fog that turned the world gray and uncertain. And as the boat approached the section of riverbank where the original Ruth had last been seen, young Ruth began to sing, performing the melody her mother had taught her. The wordless song that had been passed down like precious cargo from one generation to the next. Young Ruth had prepared for this moment for weeks, knowing that the Delta Queen's schedule would bring them past the Marchant plantation on a morning when weather conditions might approximate those of the day when the original Ruth had disappeared. She had studied the old stories carefully, asking her mother and other elders in the community for every detail they could remember, trying to understand what exactly had happened and whether it could be replicated or at least honored through some form of commemoration. Ada had been reluctant to share all the details, worried that her daughter's obsession with the original Ruth's fate might lead to dangerous choices or expectations, but eventually she had told young Ruth everything she knew, including Celeste Broussard's theories about water as a doorway between worlds, and the possibility that the original Ruth had found some form of escape that transcended normal physical reality. As young Ruth sang that morning, standing on the deck of the Delta Queen with the mist swirling around her and the paddle wheels churning through brown water below, she felt a connection to the woman whose name she carried that went beyond simple family tribute or historical curiosity. She felt as if she was completing a circuit that had been left open for 2 decades, as if her voice was reaching back through time to harmonize with a voice that had been silenced or transformed, or perhaps just relocated to a space where normal human perception couldn't follow. The melody flowed from her throat with surprising ease, as if she had sung it 1,000 times before rather than just in private practice. And she noticed that several crew members had stopped their work to listen, their faces showing a mixture of appreciation and puzzlement at the strange song being performed for no apparent audience. Her voice rose through the mist, strong and clear despite her nervousness. And for several minutes, nothing unusual happened, the boat continuing its progress upriver while Ruth sang, and the crew went about their duties, and the fog pressed in from all sides. But then, just as they drew even with the specific spot where Ada had found the blue shawl 20 years earlier, young Ruth heard something that made her heart stop. A second voice joining her own, coming from somewhere off the port side, singing in perfect harmony with a tone and quality that matched her mother's descriptions of the original Ruth's voice exactly. The experience lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though time seemed to behave strangely during those moments, stretching and compressing in ways that made accurate measurement impossible. Young Ruth continued singing while listening to this second voice, trying to determine its location and nature, trying to decide if she was actually hearing another person or if the sound was being generated by her own mind, desperate to connect with the past. The second voice seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, from the water and the air, and perhaps from inside young Ruth's own chest, where her heart was beating hard enough to shake her whole body. The harmony was perfect, the two voices blending in ways that created overtones and resonances that filled the space around the boat with sonic beauty that seemed almost visible, as if sound was becoming light, or light was becoming sound. Young Ruth tried to see through the mist to locate the source of this second voice, but the fog was too thick and the boat was moving too quickly, and within moments they had passed the location, and the second voice faded, until only her own remained audible. She stood on deck for several more minutes, in stunned silence, while her heart hammered against her ribs and her mind raced to process what she had just experienced. When she finally went to the captain to report what had happened, he patted her shoulder in a condescending way and said she had probably heard an echo off the bank, or maybe another boat worker singing somewhere else on the vessel. Perfectly reasonable explanations that young Ruth knew were wrong because the second voice had been too clear, too distinct, too similar to the descriptions she had heard her entire life. Several of the crew members approached young Ruth later that day to tell her privately that they too had heard the second voice, that it hadn't been imagination or echo, but something genuinely anomalous that had occurred during her singing. One man, an older black freedman who worked as a deckhand, told her that he had been working riverboats for 30 years and had heard the singing ghost story many times, but had never believed it until that morning when he heard two distinct voices harmonizing in the mist. Another crew member, a white man from Kentucky who claimed no belief in supernatural phenomena, said that the sound had raised the hair on his arms and neck in a way that no natural acoustic effect had ever done, and that he couldn't explain what had happened but knew it wasn't normal. That night, back in New Orleans in the room she shared with her mother, young Ruth described the experience in detail, and Ada listened with an expression that cycled through disbelief and wonder, and something that might have been fear or might have been joy. Ada said that perhaps the original Ruth was still out there somehow, existing in whatever space or state she had found when she disappeared, and that maybe young Ruth's decision to sing at that specific location on that specific morning had created a moment of connection between two people separated by time and circumstance and the strange barrier between normal reality and whatever lay beyond it. The Civil War changed everything in ways both immediate and gradual, bringing Union soldiers up the river and Confederate resistance and battles that turned the Mississippi red with blood at several points along its length. The Marchant Plantation was occupied by Union forces in 1862, and Vincent Marchant fled to Texas, leaving his property in the hands of the Army, which used it as a supply depot and eventually as a refugee camp for formerly enslaved people who had nowhere else to go. Marcus lived to see this transformation, surviving long enough to witness the beginning of the end of the slavery system that had defined his existence, and he died in 1864 with a smile on his weathered face, having told everyone who would listen about Ruth and how she had known something they didn't, how she had found freedom before freedom came looking for anyone else. The occupation of the Marchant Plantation by Union forces created a period of chaos and uncertainty that both liberated and endangered the formerly enslaved people who suddenly found themselves without masters but also without resources or clear legal status. The Union soldiers varied wildly in their attitudes toward black people, some genuinely committed to emancipation and treating formerly enslaved people with basic human decency, others viewing them as nuisances or opportunities for exploitation, not substantially different from how Southern slave owners had viewed them. The transition from slavery to whatever was coming next proved messy and complicated in ways that nobody had fully anticipated, with formerly enslaved people trying to navigate new realities, while former masters and overseers plotted ways to reassert control through different mechanisms once the war ended. Ada, who was now in her 40s and had raised her daughter Ruth to young adulthood, experienced the war years with a mixture of hope and fear that many formerly enslaved people shared. She had lived to see the thing that had seemed impossible for so long, the actual end of legal slavery, But she also understood that white people's commitment to racial equality was limited at best, and that the struggle for genuine freedom would continue long after the last battle was fought. She thought often about her friend Ruth, the original Ruth, who had disappeared 20 years earlier, and wondered whether Ruth had somehow known that this was coming, whether her disappearance had been a form of early escape from a system whose days were numbered even if nobody realized it at the time. The riverbank where Ruth had vanished became a gathering place during the war years for formerly enslaved people seeking some form of spiritual connection or historical continuity in a time of massive upheaval. People would go there to sing the old song that Ruth had sung, sometimes individually and sometimes in groups, and they reported various experiences ranging from feeling nothing unusual to experiencing powerful emotional releases to occasionally hearing that mysterious second voice that seemed to emanate from the water itself. These gatherings took on aspects of religious services, even though they weren't affiliated with any particular church or denomination, becoming instead a form of indigenous spiritual practice that drew on African traditions, filtered through the specific history of this place and these people. Marcus's death in 1864 marked the passing of one of the last people who had known Ruth personally and could testify from direct experience about what had happened the morning she disappeared. His funeral drew a large crowd, including many people who had been sold away from the Marchant plantation over the years but had returned once emancipation made such movement possible, and the service included extended singing of Ruth's melody, performed by dozens of voices, blending in complex harmonies that would have been impossible in the rigid structure of slavery, but which flourished in the relative freedom of the war's aftermath. Marcus was buried in the small cemetery plot beyond the quarters, and at his grave people told stories about both Marcus and Ruth, linking their fates in a narrative about resistance and escape and the various ways that enslaved people had found to maintain their humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. The war ended and Reconstruction began, and life continued its forward motion, carrying everyone into an uncertain future where the rules were being rewritten, even as old patterns and prejudices persisted in new forms. The story of Ruth's disappearance continued to circulate through the black community along the river, taking on new meanings in the context of emancipation, becoming not just a tale of individual escape, but a broader metaphor for transformation and the unexpected ways that freedom could manifest. The Reconstruction period brought both hope and disappointment to formerly enslaved people along the Mississippi River, as the promise of genuine equality clashed with the reality of white resistance to black advancement. New laws granted citizenship and voting rights to black men, while doing little to provide the economic resources that would have made those rights meaningful, and white Southerners quickly developed systems of sharecropping and convict leasing that replicated many aspects of slavery under different names. The formerly enslaved people who had lived on the Marchant plantation dispersed gradually during these years, some heading north to cities like Chicago and Detroit where industrial jobs beckoned, others moving to nearby towns where they tried to establish independent lives as farmers or tradespeople, still others remaining in the area because they lacked resources to go elsewhere, or because they felt attached to the land where they had suffered and survived for so long. Ada chose to stay in New Orleans with her daughter Ruth, feeling too old and tired to attempt a fresh start elsewhere, and wanting to remain close to the places and people who constituted her known world. She continued her work as a seamstress, gradually building a modest client base among both black and white customers who appreciated her skill with needle and thread, and she took satisfaction in watching her daughter grow into a capable young woman who taught music and raised her own family with the dignity that Ada herself had fought to maintain throughout decades of oppression. Ada lived long enough to see some of her grandchildren born, and she told them stories about their namesake, the original Ruth. Though the stories had evolved over the years into something part history and part legend, the factual details blurring into mythic significance. Young Ruth grew into a woman who made her living as a music teacher in New Orleans, teaching piano and voice to students of both races in a city that was slowly and painfully learning to navigate its new reality. She married a carpenter named Gabriel Wright in 1867, and they had 3 children together, and Ruth taught all of them to sing the melody her mother had taught her, passing it down to another generation as a kind of musical heirloom that connected them to a past they had never experienced directly, but which shaped their present nonetheless. Gabriel Wright was a good husband by the standards of the time and place, meaning he worked hard to provide for his family and didn't beat his wife or drink away their money, though like most men of his generation he expected women to handle all domestic responsibilities regardless of their other obligations. He had been born enslaved on a plantation in Alabama and had escaped to Union lines during the war, serving briefly as a laborer for the army before making his way to New Orleans, where he apprenticed himself to a free black carpenter and learned a trade that would sustain him through the difficult years ahead. Gabriel had heard the story of the original Ruth from his wife and found it interesting in an abstract way, but didn't invest it with the same spiritual significance that Ruth and her mother did, viewing it instead as an unfortunate historical event that had been embellished over time into something more mysterious than it probably was. The 3 children that Ruth and Gabriel raised, 2 daughters named Ada and Celeste after important women in the family history, and a son named Marcus, after the blacksmith who had been part of the original Ruth's community, grew up hearing the song and the story that went with it. The children absorbed these family traditions with varying degrees of interest and belief, the oldest daughter Ada becoming particularly attached to the history and insisting on visiting the old plantation site whenever possible, while Celeste viewed it as a nice story but nothing more than that, and Marcus seemed largely indifferent, except when his mother insisted he participate in family commemorations. This range of responses reflected broader patterns in how black families processed their slavery heritage, some embracing it as crucial identity marker, while others preferred to look forward rather than backward, focusing on building futures rather than dwelling on painful pasts. Ada lived to see her grandchildren grow, passing away peacefully in 1876 at the age of 56, worn out by decades of hardship but satisfied that she had survived to see the end of slavery and the beginning of something else, even if that something else remained imperfect and incomplete. At her funeral, young Ruth and her children sang the old melody together, 4 voices blending in harmony that seemed to expand beyond the small church where the service was held, carrying out into the New Orleans streets, where it mixed with the sounds of city life, carts and horses and other voices, all of it together, creating the complicated music of human existence. The years continued to pass, and the original Ruth story became more legend than history, the details blurring and shifting with each retelling until it was impossible to separate fact from interpretation, from pure invention. But the core of it remained constant. A woman who had stood on a riverbank in the mist and sung to a passing boat and then vanished, leaving behind only questions and a voice that supposedly still echoed across the water on certain mornings when conditions were right. In 1895, a historian named Lydia Morrison became interested in documenting the folklore and oral traditions of formerly enslaved people in Louisiana. And she made a particular study of the Ruth story, interviewing dozens of people who had various versions to share. Morrison's research confirmed that there had indeed been an enslaved woman named Ruth Fields, who had disappeared from the Belmont plantation in March of 1841, and that searches for her had proven fruitless, and that reports of mysterious singing near that location had persisted for decades. Morrison published her findings in a small academic journal, treating the supernatural elements with scholarly skepticism while acknowledging the story's significance as a reflection of enslaved people's spiritual beliefs and their need to imagine forms of escape beyond the physical. Morrison was a white woman from Boston who had come south with missionary zeal to document what she saw as disappearing cultural traditions before they were lost to history and assimilation. Her approach to the material was both sympathetic and condescending in ways typical of progressive white scholars of her era, recognizing the humanity and cultural richness of formerly enslaved people, while simultaneously viewing them through a lens of racial paternalism that assumed their beliefs and practices needed translation and interpretation for educated, white audiences. Morrison spent 3 months in Louisiana conducting interviews, mostly with elderly black people who had direct memories of slavery or who had been told stories by parents and grandparents who experienced it firsthand. Her interview with Ada, who was by then 75 years old and living with her daughter Ruth's family, provided much of the detailed information that Morrison included in her published article. Ada's memory remained sharp despite her age, and she recounted the events surrounding the original Ruth's disappearance with clarity and emotion that Morrison found both touching and scientifically frustrating, as Ada refused to separate the factual details from the spiritual interpretations that gave the story its meaning for her community. Morrison tried multiple times to get Ada to acknowledge that Ruth had probably drowned or escaped to the north through conventional means, but Ada consistently rejected these mundane explanations in favor of the more mysterious possibilities that Celeste Broussard had suggested decades earlier. Morrison also interviewed several riverboat workers and captains who reported hearing the mysterious singing over the years, and she was struck by the consistency of their descriptions, despite coming from different times and circumstances. The singing was always described as a woman's voice performing a wordless melody, always heard in mist or fog conditions near the location where Ruth had disappeared, always seeming to come from multiple directions simultaneously, and always producing an emotional response in listeners that went beyond what normal music typically generated. Morrison documented these accounts carefully but ultimately concluded in her article that the singing was probably caused by acoustic phenomena related to fog and water that created auditory illusions, combined with collective expectation and suggestion that predisposed people to interpret ambiguous sounds in specific ways. Morrison's article appeared in the Journal of American Folklore in December of 1895, under the title, River Spirits and Slave Narratives, The Legend of the Singing Woman of Louisiana, and it reached a small academic audience that found it interesting but not particularly significant. The article was one of dozens that Morrison published over her career documenting various aspects of African American folklore and oral tradition, and it languished in academic obscurity for decades, before being rediscovered by later scholars interested in the cultural production of enslaved and formerly enslaved communities. Morrison herself died in 1922 without ever returning to Louisiana or following up on her research about Ruth, moving on to other projects and other regions. In her endless quest to document traditions she viewed as primitive but valuable artifacts of human cultural diversity, the 20th century brought new technologies and new ways of understanding the world. But the Mississippi River continued its eternal flow, indifferent to human progress or setbacks, carrying boats that were now powered by diesel and oil rather than steam and wood, moving commerce and people along the same paths that had been traveled for centuries. The old Belmont plantation, which had briefly been the Marchant plantation, was broken up and sold to various buyers, becoming a collection of small farms and eventually being swallowed by suburban development as New Orleans expanded outward in the 1950s and 60s. The transformation of the plantation land into suburban housing developments happened gradually over several decades, beginning with the construction of a few modest homes in the 1920s and accelerating dramatically after World War II, when returning veterans needed places to live and federal housing policies encouraged suburban expansion. The developers who purchased the land had no knowledge of or interest in its history as a slave plantation, viewing it simply as acreage to be converted into profit through residential construction. The quarters where enslaved people had lived were demolished without ceremony. The big house that had belonged to the Belmont and Marchant families was torn down to make way for a shopping center, and the riverbank where Ruth had stood and sung and vanished was incorporated into a public park that bore no historical markers or acknowledgement of what had occurred there over a century earlier. The story of Ruth's disappearance faded from common knowledge as the generations who had known the original witnesses passed away, becoming an obscure bit of local lore that occasionally surfaced in history books or folklore collections, but which no longer resonated with the same emotional intensity. The singing was rarely reported anymore, though whether this was because it had genuinely stopped or because people no longer paid attention to such things in a world of radios and televisions and constant noise was impossible to determine. But in certain families descended from the people who had lived on the Belmont plantation in 1841, the story of Ruth was still told to children and grandchildren, still preserved as something important even if its exact meaning had become uncertain. Ruth Wright's descendants kept the tradition of singing the old melody, teaching it to each new generation as their contribution to keeping alive a connection to an ancestor they would never meet, but whose choices, whatever they had been, had somehow made possible the freedoms they now enjoyed. In 2015, a great-great-great-granddaughter of the original Ruth's friend Ada, a woman named Denise Johnson, who was a music professor at Tulane University, became interested in tracing the history of the melody that had been passed down through her family. Denise spent months researching, following leads through archives, and conducting oral history interviews with elderly relatives, slowly piecing together the story of Ruth Fields and her mysterious disappearance. She discovered that the melody itself was probably of West African origin, a fragment of musical tradition that had survived the Middle Passage and slavery and everything that came after, preserved through voices and memories when nothing else could be kept. Denise decided to compose a larger work based on the melody and the story behind it, creating a choral piece for multiple voices that incorporated the original tune while expanding it into something new. The piece was performed at a concert in New Orleans in March of 2016, exactly 175 years after Ruth's disappearance, and the audience included descendants of various families connected to the Belmont plantation, black and white people coming together to witness this musical remembrance of a woman whose life had been constrained by slavery, but whose disappearance had somehow transcended those constraints. After the concert, Denise organized a trip to the location where the Belmont plantation had stood, now a stretch of commercial property near the river that bore no resemblance to its historical appearance. About 30 people gathered there on a misty morning in late March, and together they sang the old melody, their voices rising toward passing barges and container ships that had replaced the graceful steamboats of Ruth's era. The singing went on for several minutes, a collective act of remembrance and connection. And when it ended, several people reported hearing, just for a moment, what sounded like an additional voice joining the chorus from somewhere beyond their circle, a voice that harmonized perfectly with their own, before fading into the ambient sounds of river and wind and modern industrial life. Whether that final voice was real or imagined, whether it represented some genuine echo of Ruth Fields, or merely the power of collective hope and belief, is a question that each person present had to answer for themselves. But standing there on the bank of the Mississippi River, looking out at the brown water that had witnessed so much history and carried so many stories, it was possible to believe that some disappearances are not endings, but transformations, that some voices persist beyond the bodies that produced them, that the barrier between the possible and impossible is sometimes thinner than it appears. Ruth Fields stood on a riverbank in 1841 and sang to a passing boat, and then vanished into mystery, leaving behind a story that would echo through generations, like the voice that supposedly still haunts that stretch of river on foggy mornings. Whether she drowned or escaped, or found some third option that the world has no vocabulary to describe, her disappearance became more than just one woman's fate. It became a testament to the human need for hope, the belief that freedom exists even when all evidence suggests otherwise, the conviction that the universe sometimes offers unexpected exits to those desperate or brave or lucky enough to find them. The paddle wheels no longer churn through the Mississippi in the way they did when Ruth sang her songs, and the mist that rises off the water now mingles with industrial pollution and modern progress, but the river itself remains, eternal and indifferent, and full of secrets it will never fully reveal. And somewhere in the space between memory and legend, between history and myth, Ruth Fields continues to sing, her voice a reminder that some disappearances are their own form of freedom, that the boundary between the bound and the liberated is sometimes just a song away, that the river always offers passage to those who know how to ask in the right way at the right moment. The story ends where it began, with a woman on a riverbank and a boat whistle in the mist, and a voice rising toward possibility. Everything else is interpretation, the meaning we make from absence, the hope we construct from mystery. Ruth Fields disappeared after the riverboat passed at dawn, and in that disappearance, she became something larger than one person's history, something that continues to resonate through the years, like a song that has no final note, only an echo that carries forward into whatever future is listening.